Hey, Julia Barzik here from Wise Investigator. Today I spoke with Dr. Rohith Chandrasekar. He's a technical fellow and director of emerging space technologies at Leidos. There he leads teams developing novel capabilities for space and sensing systems. Previously, he served as a program manager at DARPA, where he was guiding ambitious research portfolios in advanced optics, quantum sensors, and radar technologies supporting defense and national security. His career bridges government, industry, and academia to accelerate innovation. So this interview is absolutely packed. Rohith breaks down how DARPA program managers think in plain English, including a distinction I find very helpful. He said DARPA isn't trying to fund technologies, it's trying to build capabilities. And this is a framing that will serve you well to keep in mind. So this shift alone can change how you approach DARPA, how you write, and how you present your pitch. So he also talks about how ideas becomes programs at DARPAs. So this is from concept through solicitation, why you should be engaging early and often, and the reasons for that. Oh my gosh, I love this one. Okay, it's time to reach out now. That's what I'm always encouraging folks on. He talks about the Young Faculty Award. So again, when to reach out, how to think about that, and how to make a strong first contact, why a second meeting is really more important, and what's critical about that second meeting. He gives some guidance for what to do in program reviews so you can keep the audience engaged and following your progress. And we also get into partnering with industry and how you might go about that. So get ready for a good one, and here we go. So when you were a program manager at DARPA, what were you actually trying to accomplish? So in plain English, how would you describe that role?
PMs always have different routes on how they get to DARPA, but eventually what brings them to DARPA and successfully brings them in as a PM is their interest to really develop disruptive technologies that's going to bring technologies to the warfighter at an accelerated timeline. Generally, that means focusing on a certain technical areas or in certain technologies or developing certain capabilities that builds on their expertise and their interests. But it almost always leads to asking questions to a community that's perhaps asked a question in a certain way for several years or decades. And they're brought to DARPA to ask a different question of that same community to get them to think it in a different way. This may be, taking a different approach to an age-old problem, or it may be getting two communities that have traditionally never spoken together to speak together for the first time to come up with a new solution, or to accelerate the maturation of a certain technology that could impact a certain set of technology areas or capabilities. And so when I joined DARPA, my interest was really in understanding how materials innovations, and importantly, materials innovations that I'd seen during my PhD and during my time as a SETA at DARPA as well, could really get accelerated and matured to impact the field of infrared sensors and electromagnetic sensors broadly. And my interest was not necessarily in fundamental research in those materials, but rather in development research to understand what were the requirements for those materials to make an impact for true use cases that could be accelerated in deployment to the warfighter.
Okay, so if a viewer is not able to watch this whole video and you want to communicate just one thing that a faculty member should remember about getting funded, what would that be?
Certainly, PMs are always interested in providing funding to faculty members in order to help support their graduate students and help support their research. However, every faculty member should be aware that what the PM is trying to do is to create demonstrable impact. And what that means is that the research, while certainly the faculty member's interest is to fund their group, and that certainly is important, the real goal is how is the outcome of that research going to transition to a capability? Or put another way, if I don't end up funding that research, is it going to be a significant detriment in accelerating that technology's timeline into getting into the hands of a warfighter down the line? And so a faculty member, whenever engaging with a DARPA PM, should be thinking about what is the risk of not funding this? And what is the technology that's not going to make it in its way to the battlefield? Or with the emphasis of dual use now, even into commercial applications, if this effort was not funded. The PM, again, is always focused on impact. And at DARPA, what we're always told is that we are not there to develop technologies. We are there to develop capabilities. And so the technology that gets us there may look different in different time periods. And so any faculty member reaching out to a PM should be less focused on trying to sell a technology and more focused on trying to sell a capability and perhaps having different approaches to getting there. At least that leads to an organic conversation between yourself and the PM in order to identify what's likely the best approach to move forward to get funding.
Okay, that's an important distinction. Thank you. So could you walk us through the life of an idea that might turn into a proposal and maybe even a funded effort? What would that life cycle look like at DARPA?
Yeah, life cycle for programs always come in different flavors. I've had ones where it started off with a question as to reaching out to different folks in the community, asking a question and say, let me know when I break physics. And I was never told no. And so therefore, it started to beg the question as to whether I need to move forward with this as a program concept. That alone is not enough to make a program as you'd expect. It's one, asking the question to understand what is technically feasible or what is the art of possible with some additional funding. But then going back to that point of the capability aspect, how do I now tie that to a certain number of use cases that's going to make a demonstrable impact on the warfighter capabilities? I was sitting in the defense sciences office, and so many people tend to think that because it's defense science, it is not as tied to the mission. However, while the intent of the office may vary with different leadership changes, what has been traditionally a common thread in DSO, for example, has been that the research is mission informed, if not mission focused. And so when reaching out to the PM, that mission is always going to be critical. And so what happens is starting with an idea that trying to assess if this is technically viable, trying to understand what would be the aspects of this that need to be matured in order to make this to make it realistic. Is it a individual component challenge? Is it an integration challenge? Is it a concept of operations challenge? Is it a bureaucratic challenge to get other folks in the government to buy into this concept? There are different challenges based on the type of program you're trying to sell and based on where you are in DARPA, for example. But figuring out at the end of the day, what is the right question to ask to get the community to move at the speed at which you require them to deliver the impact that you want on that time scale is really what the program concept and lifetime is. Now that, if you look at the details of that in terms of the process, it of course follows a timeline of me coming up with, or a PM coming up with a certain number of charts to communicate the Hallmeyer Catechism. How do I convey what I'm trying to do? How are we doing this today, and why are we failing at it? What is the new insight that I have that allows me to really succeed at being able to do what I want now? And who's going to care? The impact that I'm going to have, how's that going to make an impact on the warfighter? So answering those questions are always the first thing that you almost always do. And then putting together charts to communicate that with your office leadership, that gets entertained with the director of the agency. And then, of course, then you go down the path of a tech council pitch where you start coming up with a full briefing that's then pitched to the agency to solicit funding. And then after that, the world sees the public documentation of the solicitation and such. But the common thread throughout all of this is the performers are in a position where they need to answer questions. They see a solicitation and they need to answer the question. The PM's job is to figure out what's the right way to ask that question, because even for a single use case, there's different ways of looking at it. The question is based on the status that we're at now, based on where the technology lies now, based on where the community is now, as well as the requirements on the political climate and what we need to address. What's the right way to ask that question to move at the speed we need?
Okay. And what I'm thinking about in this context is the Young Faculty Award. So a lot of PIs are out there thinking, oh, I want to see that announcement and I want to read what those topics are, and they absolutely should take a look at those. But if maybe I'm reading too much into what you're saying, but what I'm hearing a little bit is perhaps conversations should be happening when it's the right time to have those conversations and when it's the right time to approach DARPA, rather than waiting, say, for topics to come out. So what would someone who may be considering the YFA, should they reach out at any time or should they wait for that announcement?
The rule of thumb with DARPA is never wait to engage. You constantly need to be engaging. And DARPA is a harder agency to engage than others in the government, for example, simply because if you just go to the DARPA.mil website, there's a couple of names that change there every month. And I think within the course of a year, 25% of the agency changes. simply because PMs have a 1-year tenure. And so if you end up waiting 6 months to engage, the person you thought would have been the ideal candidate for your research may no longer be there. So there's never more of an impetus to engage DARPA than now, and identifying the right champion for your research. And again, that champion may come in different flavors as well. It may be somebody who has the exact same technical background as you, and so therefore wants to see the maturation of that technology. Or it may be somebody who has no idea what your technology does, but knows that the capability is important, and so therefore wants to see the successful maturation of that idea. It depends on the different factors that play in their mind as they're thinking about their portfolio, and really what are the requirements on technologies to get matured in the current climate. And so I would encourage always to engage. YFA is an interesting vehicle. Having run the program, I'm aware of kind of the history of it. It was originally created as a way for making academic institutions more and more aware as to how to bid to a DARPA type proposal and to help them actually mature themselves in writing competitive proposals to big DARPA programs. And now we see that YFA has been wildly successful at doing that, given the number of universities that bid for large DARPA programs. But that being said, YFA still has a very clear and very compelling use case even now in order to help mature not universities, but specific researchers who are rising stars in the academic community, and to help them to start thinking about defense applications and defense research. And so PMs will always look at YFA as a way to address white spaces in their program portfolios. So they may have a program addressing a certain technology and they say, you know what, maybe we're not being aggressive enough in a certain area. And so I really need some more basic research investigation into this topic that maybe rounds out the program and gives me a better sense as to what the state of the art is. Given that as a YFA, you may not have full visibility into all of those programs, it's important to consistently engage to see where you might fit within that white space chart.
Great. And since we're talking about DARPA staffing a bit, I heard you mention that you were a SETA, SETA. I was a SETA at Army Research Office. That's how I started working there. Could you explain what is a SETA, and are these people that faculty should reach out to? I think I know the answer to that. And not pass them by just because they're saying, oh, it's not the program manager. Could you talk a little bit about that role?
Yeah, so there are different types of SETAs. SETAs are effectively contractors. They are not government personnel. They come in different flavors. Generally, PMs have what's called a technical SETA. And so that's a SETA generally with a PhD or a very long career in a certain technical area. And they bring them in to provide technical guidance and expertise to help shape program concepts, do research to understand white space and what is the lay of the land in a certain technology area. Certainly help with developing documentation for programs, reviewing proposals. Their reviews are not official reviews by any means, but their review notes certainly make their way to the PM and may impact their thoughts on a proposal as well. And finally, when the program is then approved and funding selections are made, which SETAs certainly support, SETAs are part of the actual program lifecycle and being on calls with all of the performers and reviewing their progress and helping to, one, provide feedback to them, but also to help communicate the significance of their research up the chain by providing the PMs, briefing packets on that research and kind of condensing it into a digestible form that can be taken up to either the office director or even the agency director or even externally out of DARPA. And so SETAs really have a broad awareness of what DARPA is trying to do, especially in their support to the program manager. The other aspects that SETAs bring is that they are not limited to the same 4-year timeline as a PM. And so in many cases, they actually bring continuity to the agency more so than the PMs do. PMs also have a financial SETA, somebody who manages their actual books for the entire program. And they also may have a programmatic SETA, somebody who is there to, especially ones that have large portfolios of many programs, keeping them aware of all aspects across the entire portfolio, and also perhaps even helping to transition those ideas from programs out to different agencies or to other customers in the government. So I would certainly encourage that as you engage PMs, if you identify who their SETA is, it's a good way of having an ear within DARPA. It is not the official ear for sure, but certainly would be helpful to have their awareness of your research to help communicate the significance to the PM and beyond. No, I think that's about it.
Okay, well, since we're in the nuts and bolts here, this is really helpful. I heard you say program reviews, and I'm thinking that people could possibly use some guidance on how to approach those program reviews. Would a PI who's funded by DARPA get some pretty clear and comprehensive instructions on how to approach a review, be it a formal review or even an informal type of review? Or how do you suggest that PIs learn how to leverage those program reviews as best as possible, especially if it's the first time they're doing something like that?
Yeah. And when you say program reviews, you mean progress
That
reviews
kind
of
of thing,
programs.
yes.
Program reviews are common across not just at DARPA, but all types of programs across all government customers, where you review progress on the research. I feel like one pitfall that performers generally fall into is that they think that once you're part of the program, you no longer need to sell your research. And that's a common pitfall to fall under, and one that can be detrimental. And the way you see this is how the first slide is generally structured. It's always good practice to go into a meeting assuming that the audience does not know what you're doing. I think going into slide one and jumping into the details of the third technical challenge you have within your effort is likely going to lose your audience pretty quickly, even if they are aware. These are the folks that selected your program, sure, but they probably fund only 25, 30 other performers and are keeping track of their research as well. And so as a performer going into a program review, it is never a waste to spend the first 5 minutes to recap on what is the goal of this effort, what is the expected impact of the effort, to then further solidify the significance of it. A very quick overview as to all the technical challenges you're aiming to address, and then say, here's the one we're going to focus on today. Going into the nitty-gritty details is important for a PM, but it needs to be provided context as to why it's important over the broad scope of your effort, and therefore the broad scope of the entire program, and likely what is going to be able to successfully transition out of that program to a technology that could be fielded.
And I think that could be especially relevant for a place like DARPA, where you have a lot of turnover of staff, because like you said, there could be people who are in a role that is familiar to you, but it's a new person. And so that is their first exposure to your work. And I'm thinking this extends also to places like NSF, where there's a lot of reorganization going on there now. So it may be the case that PIs are running into having non-experts, or even just people who are maybe experts but not familiar with the funded research, learning about it for the first time. So this is a skill that's going to apply. It always has applied, but maybe more and more as things change in the future too. So yes.
Yeah, as PM turnover and customer turnover are certainly a risk. It's always a challenge. And again, everything I'm sharing about DARPA is my experience. I'm no longer at DARPA, and so therefore I finished my tenure up in 2024, and so you should always look to current folks in DARPA to understand what the pulse is of what's going on there right now. But regardless, the turnover of PMs is a challenge. Now, the incoming PM may be entirely enamored with the idea and be exactly on board with it, may, for example, come from that same technical field and think it's a solved problem, or may think that there's a part of it that's actually really interesting, but the rest of it is a waste. At the end of the day, the faculty member or any entity trying to garner funding from that, at the end of the day, is we would like to see our ideas keep moving forward through funding. And so I think flexibility is going to be important to figure out how to work with that, with let's say the new incoming PM, to find out what are the problems they're trying to solve. Because again, their clock just started, so they have 4 years at DARPA now. And so there's an opportunity to build a relationship there where you could identify the problems they're trying to solve, and maybe some of the solutions you have within your research group could address that. So I think flexibility is key at those kind of fracture points. They could be great kind of starting points for relationships that lead to more funding down the line, or they could be quite challenging as well.
Okay. And so what would your advice be for making that first contact? I believe that DARPA has on the website like a contact form type portal. I'm not sure if that's still there, but that has been there in the past. They may also be able to get contact information or email addresses for individual PMs or other staff. How should someone approach making that first contact? What should they expect from a first conversation? Or would someone be willing to have a conversation with them without having a white paper prepared?
Yeah, certainly the rule of thumb with DARPA is it's always first dot last name at darpa.mil. The only way to if they throw a wrench at you with a middle initial or something like that. But usually it's almost always first dot last name. And you can look at the DARPA website for how they spell their first and last name, because it's exactly how they show up on the website as well. So There may be questions as to whether Dave is David, for example, but it's always how it shows up on the website. So that would be the first way, but send an email to them directly. The inquiry form also works. However, it does show up as a public inquiry in the title. And so I think there may be I know that as a PM, I always made an emphasis to respond to those, and ones that I thought would be very useful to pursue. But PMs are busy folks, and so sending a direct email would be useful as well. The way I always recommend approaching that first contact is, I think, making the assumption that you're going to walk out of that first meeting with your idea being funded is likely going to be is going to kind of put a damper on your expectations. The best way to approach it is, again, to build a relationship. Is to get them aware of what kind of impact are you trying to have as a faculty member? What are the challenges that you're trying to address, and why do those challenges matter in the current climate? Why is it important with things going on now? Again, why is it now that we need to be funding your research? Why is that important? And having maybe a couple of ideas that are not entirely fully fleshed out, but at a minimum, I would think that you should have the first 4 Hallmeyer questions answered. What are you trying to do? So in your first idea that you're going to present, all 4 should be answered. What are you trying to do? What's the current state of the art? Why is it a problem? And why should the defense care? And why should that specific PM care, in fact, if you have some information on their background? And then what's the new insight that you have in your group that allows us to do this? And why should someone care? So again, why is this going to have the impact that you think it's going to have? And why should DARPA be the one to invest in it now? One of the main things that DARPA is constantly asking is, how far does DARPA need to take with the technology before they pass it off to someone else? Coming from a material science background is actually challenging at DARPA, because I remember at some point the agency director had said, we did a count and there's been 100 material science programs at DARPA. And so is it DARPA's problem to continue to fund material science? The argument, yes, it is. However, we need to be able to make that justification as to why it's still a DARPA problem. It's a DARPA hard problem that needs to be addressed now. And so making that clear is important. And then I would have maybe 2 or 3 other ideas that are less fleshed out, but again, not with the intent of walking out with a check for any one of these, but more giving a sense as to what are the kind of problems you're trying to address. And more importantly, hear from the PM. The bulk of the meeting should be the PM talking and getting to know from them on what is their projected timeline, what's the arc that they have over 4 years that they want to address, and are any of those problems in alignment with technologies that you could propose?
I hear this is a very forward-thinking, future-oriented type conversation and process that you want to be having, and that makes a lot of sense. I know oftentimes if a PI is nervous about a big meeting, it can be natural to feel like, ooh, I want to show slides on all of the great work that I've done, but I'm reminding them that that's the work that you've done in the past. And if you're in a faculty position, there's no doubt that you're technically qualified, you know your stuff, you've done good work to get to where you are. So you don't have to prove yourself at that point about using what you've done in the past, but join that conversation about what's exciting about the future, right? And try to get the sponsor on your team in sense of working together towards something. Is that correct?
I agree, and I would also emphasize that the second meeting is far more important than the first one.
Okay.
Because first off, the first meeting, again, there's so many unknowns there. It's really hard to assess how that meeting is going to go. However, every person should be coming out of that meeting having learned exactly what they need to come back with in that second meeting, follow up within a relatively appropriate timeline with feedback from the PM as to what that timeline is, and then deliver on that ask. And so that second meeting is really far more important because it really assesses whether your trajectory and the PM's trajectory are in line. Is there an appropriate projection that is significant across the 2 of those? And if that's not the case, then that pretty much answers the question as to whether you're going to be able to get funding down the line. And so I think it's important to prepare for that second meeting.
And that I like that because that might make it a little bit less intimidating to have that first meeting, right? If you just have to tell yourself, this meeting's going to be pretty easy. It's going to be a friendly conversation. We're going to get to know each other a bit. Then if you do have a second meeting, okay, you got to prepare a little bit more for that one, but you don't have to worry about that before the first meeting, right? Yeah. Okay, good. I like that. So when you think about something coming in as a proposal, if we're at that stage, what would you see in the first couple pages of that document that would get you excited and that would make you think, yeah, I want to keep reading and feeling like this is something that's been communicated in a compelling way? What would you want to see when someone's introducing that idea on paper?
Yeah, so obviously there's the template that DARPA would put out. I think the first section is some kind of executive summary, and then there's always a section that's called goals and impacts. And then after that will come technical approach. As PMs, we spend a lot of time writing solicitations. And I think one of the things that most faculty members and entities focus on is what the program is trying to do and what's in scope for the program. What they tend not to do enough is focus on what is not in scope for the program. So read through the solicitation. The rule of thumb that we always said is that if you say something is not in scope the first time, the people who have been writing to DARPA for years are going to understand that. If you write it the second time, this is not in scope, then somebody who's been engaging with DARPA over the last 2 to 3 years probably is going to get the hint. And then you write it the third time, so that way somebody who's new to DARPA really gets the message that this is not of interest to this program. So we actually go through and make sure, at least as a PM, I always made sure to write it 3 times to make it very clear to anyone submitting that their idea, if it does not address the entire program scope and clearly is not in line with these facts that are aspects that are out of scope, is not going to be of interest. So I think that's the first thing. Read the solicitation, read the solicitation, read the solicitation. The second thing is the way that we come up with metrics is not a hand-wavy argument. Usually those metrics are either tied based off of what is technically feasible from a fundamental limits perspective, and then maybe walking that back a bit, or it's from a clear use case where I want to be able to achieve some capability in the field, and then you walk that back from a capability perspective to a technology perspective. But usually those metrics are important. They're developed because, one, not only is that the public-facing document, but as a PM, I've made an agreement with my leadership that this is going to be the output of my program. And so I am being held accountable, or a PM is being held accountable to meeting that goal. And so as a performer, your job is not only to meet that metric, but to help the PM show his leadership or her leadership that they've succeeded at that goal. And so what that means is that within the proposal, the first executive summary should be a quick high-level summary of the technical challenges of the program, kind of reiterating what that program is trying to do, showing your understanding of the problem, and then why your solution directly addresses those technical challenges. It's pretty much a very quick summary of H1, H3. Here's what the program's trying to do. We understood that the technical challenges are these. And in order to address those, here are the direct lineup of innovations that we're proposing. And then here are the metrics we're going to hit. We're going to hit all the metrics. And as a result, we're going to be able to achieve this by the end of the program. That's your executive summary. The second section, goals and impacts, is actually the one that I think is the most important, because that's where you're going to be able to provide justification very early on as to why your claims that you're going to be able to hit the metrics are actually true. What proof points do you have from recent research or from relevant experience from your group that builds confidence that you're actually going to be able to succeed at doing this? So that goals and impact section is actually more important than the executive summary. And then once you've built the confidence that you're going to be able to do this, then the technical approach is, let me show you how I'm going to execute this and be able to meet this within the timeline that you've proposed. So that's the way that you should think about it in a proposal, and build confidence in your ability to hit those metrics and necessarily have a solution that is in scope and responsive.
So what were some of the big things that PIs would miss there? Are there any real obvious points where PIs or submitters failed to do these things?
There's obviously many pitfalls in here, and I'm of course providing my opinion as to what I think I would want to see. This may be very different for a different PM with a different program, so this is obviously going to differ. And so why engaging with the PMs beforehand is very important, to be able to understand what are the things that they kind of attach onto and what are they looking for. And so that's important. The second thing is, especially for faculty members, I feel like in order to emphasize the defense relevance of their research, they may overcompensate by coming up with use cases and presenting how these are going to be used. So let's put our defense hat on and come up with different ideas as to how this is going to be used, and maybe even go too far down the line of thinking too defense relevant. The solicitation has already clearly laid out the metrics. It's already cleared out the goals that it wants to hit. There's no need to over-postulate on what are the use cases going to be here. Hit the metrics and prove that you can.
Yeah, that's like you said, it's already cleared that hurdle if the PM got that through.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So now moving on to think a little bit about funding and potential collaborations from industry, since you are in industry now. If a PI has been used to dealing mainly with the federal government, looking for funding, being funded by the federal government, and they're interested in learning, hey, what's out there for me in industry? And that's a very broad term, but either in terms of collaborations and or funding, how might they start that process of exploration?
So, I sit at Leidos, and Leidos is a defense contractor, and so we also work off of government funding. And so we're in the same boat as everyone else. However, one of the advantages being in a company like this is that because we are addressing technologies across a TRL scale, and TRL means technology readiness level, it gives us an awareness of the technology pulls from the higher TRL requirements and gives us a better sense as to what kind of technologies might we be looking for that are lower TRL, perhaps from a academic institution, for example, that might address that. And so by no means are we a government customer, but we are a customer nonetheless, in the sense that we are looking for technologies that can help us address future requirements. And we're working with the government to try to get that funded as well. And so I think it's important for faculty members, small businesses to think about defense primes, such as Leidos and others, as ways to help transition their concepts. How do I take the idea that I have that could be an outcome of or an output of my lab here within a university, but then how do I find the right pathway to mature that to, let's say, a higher enough TRL level to then go to the next path? We're all trying to chart the valley of death at the end of the day. And so there's different ways to do that. There's different customers for that. But defense primes may be a good way of finding the right pathway to do that. This, of course, comes down to the same things as we've discussed, which is it comes down to people at the end of the day, finding the right champion for your research, finding the right way to actually fund that moving forward. Certainly, you're not going to expect the kind of level of funding from a defense prime as you would from the government, especially if it's from, let's say, IRADs or internal investments. But perhaps that leads to a joint proposal down the line where you actually can be part of a larger solution that gets submitted to the government. So I think it's important to reach out to defense primes. I'm constantly trying to engage with academia in my position to identify the right off-ramps from their research into certain technologies that we could try to bid. And so I certainly encourage trying to engage.
Okay. And so maybe LinkedIn might be a place to look for employees at a company that you're interested in, use some keyword search within those employees and possibly come up with some people with maybe technical similarities, reach out to them there. What other ways could they find the actual individuals and their contact information? Is maybe through the university office where there's a industry relations type, or
I would take different approaches to that. There's different options available to you. As you're working with DARPA PMs and as you're engaging with them, it might even be useful to ask them if they know folks in industry that maybe you should pair up with in order to identify the right transition or way to mature this concept into something that maybe is responsive to the PM. For example, as a faculty member, I'm sure it might be quite hard to engage somebody like a PM in the strategic technologies office or in the tactical technologies office where they're building full systems, as an example. But perhaps your insight plays to a certain portion of this that is very critical. And so partnering with the right industry member might be useful there. So I think asking the PM for their inputs on that would be useful. There may be previous DARPA programs that maybe have looked at similar technologies. And so looking up for those programs online, that'll show you which PMs actually managed those in the past. Looking for those PMs and seeing where they're at to find if there's a good match. Again, having been at DARPA, most of the folks generally tend to stay within the defense environment. And there's always exceptions, of course, but at a large scale, that might be true. And so looking for common threads that might identify the right folks would be useful. Certainly welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So final question. This is a fun one, I hope. I think it will be. So what was your favorite aspect of serving as a program manager?
Serving as a program manager is the thrill of a lifetime. I think I remember even Dev Palmer, who has done a recording for your sessions before, I said, being at DARPA is like holding onto the nose of a rocket and holding on for dear life, right? I think I remember that ringing in my ears from one of his recordings. And it's true. And so being able to successfully pitch programs, work with performers, build communities, and identify how we can address problems is always exciting. I will say that some of the most exciting things for me have been taking my programs and directly bringing them to the customers and saying, here are the problems you're trying to solve. I remember for one of my programs, which was focused on night vision, we actually arranged an entire day where my program performers got to try on night vision systems to understand the limitations of current technologies and get a much more hands-on experience on the problems they were trying to address. The other favorite aspect is, when you see successful research, holding a prototype in your hand and say, this is actually what's come out of this and the kind of impact they can have, and show and tell is something that we do as kindergartners, but I think is still important even as we're in, a full industry career, because being able to hold the real impact you're trying to have and show that to a customer is always going to have a significant impact. And so many of my performers have been kind enough to send me prototypes that, of course, I had to leave when I left DARPA, but being able to really show that as an outcome and be able to speak to the impact so you can pass it to folks and have a much more hands-on experience of what's really being done is critical. Being at DARPA also provided me good opportunities to engage with even families and children on showing how on SNT and science technology and impacts that it's going to have on their lives moving forward. And so all the DARPA family days and events where folks could come in, K through 12 students could come in to learn more about research, the kind of breadth of opportunities you would have to engage with the public on the work that DARPA does is great. And so truly every day at DARPA is an exciting day. And so I still hold on to it. And I'm having only been 18 months out, I can still remember it. So I'm hoping to maintain that memory as long as I can. But I think that the most important thing for people to take away is that it's gone in a blink of an eye. 4 years goes by very quickly. And so all the more reason that folks that are engaging DARPA need to strap on, and they're holding onto the nose of that rocket as much as we are. And so they need to be ready for that pace and being excited to engage at that pace and work with DARPA. So I hope this was helpful to everyone.
It's exciting. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's very generous of you. You're a very busy person, and we really appreciate it. This is going to be of great value to many people who are considering exploring what DARPA has to offer, or even if they're already engaged. I think from your guidance, they're going to be able to do that even more effectively. So thank you so much.
No, thanks so much, Julia. Thanks for the opportunity.